The soft hum of the space station Nexus 9 vibrated through the walls, a constant reminder of the advanced technology that surrounded Lieutenant James Carter. It was supposed to be a peaceful mission, nothing more than a routine assignment to ensure that the station was operating smoothly. Yet, as he walked through the sleek corridors, something felt different. The air felt heavier, the corridors quieter than usual. There was a sense of anticipation, like something was about to happen. James paused in front of the medical ward. He had seen the patient logs earlier, but they hadn't prepared him for the real thing. Zora Ash, a warrior from the Tamar sector, was being treated here. She was known throughout the galaxy as one of the fiercest of her kind, a warrior whose reputation had been earned through countless battles and victories. But now, she lay unconscious, her life hanging by a thread. He had no personal connection to her, but the sight of her name on the medical files stirred something in him. There was a story behind every name, and he couldn't help but wonder what had brought this fearsome warrior to the brink of death. But as he stepped inside, he had no idea how much his own life was about to change. Inside, the sterile scent of antiseptic filled his nostrils, the sharp scent cutting through the normally musty air of the station. The soft beeping of machines filled the room, their steady rhythm like a heartbeat, a reminder that life was still clinging to Zora Ash. She was a tall figure, her golden eyes closed in rest, her green skin almost glowing in the artificial light. She looked peaceful now, but the scars of her past were evident in the tensed muscles of her jaw and the tightness of her brow. James had heard about her, about how she had been a leader, a warrior who had fought for her people. He wondered if she had ever imagined that this would be her fate, lying unconscious, fighting for her life on a space station far from her home. As James moved closer to the bed, he felt a sudden chill crawl up his spine. Something was watching him. He turned quickly, his eyes scanning the room. There, in the doorway, stood a small figure, a young girl, no older than 16, with wide eyes and a look of awe on her face. Her short, silver hair framed her face, and her blue skin shimmered faintly in the light. She was a Tamar, just like Zorash. But unlike the warrior, this girl appeared fragile, almost delicate. Her eyes, however, were filled with a depth that betrayed her youth. She had seen things, experienced pain and loss far beyond her years. The girl's gaze locked onto James, and for a moment, neither of them moved. Then, in a voice that was barely above a whisper, she spoke.
"Mom, it's him."
The words sent a shock through James, leaving him frozen in place. The girl's breath caught in her throat as she took a small step forward. "The human who saved me." James blinked, trying to process what she had just said. He had been many things in his life, soldier, diplomat, peacekeeper, but never had he been called a savior. He didn't even know this girl, so how could he have saved her? Before he could respond, the girl stepped closer to the bed, her hand trembling as she reached out to touch Zora Ash's arm. She spoke softly, her words heavy with emotion. "I remember you."
"You saved me when I was just a child."
James felt his heart skip a beat. The memories flooded back, vivid and sharp. He had been on a mission, deep in enemy territory, when he had come across a group of Tamar refugees fleeing from pirates. They had been trapped, surrounded on all sides, and he had made the decision to help them. He had gone against orders, risking everything to save them. Among them had been a child, terrified and alone, her body bruised and broken from the attack. James had been the one to carry her out of that hellish situation, saving her life with little regard for his own. But he had never known who she was, only that he had made a promise to her that he would protect her. The girl's eyes were filled with a mixture of awe and something deeper, something more personal. She had not forgotten him. The memory had stayed with her, etched into her soul, and now, years later, it had brought her here, to this very room. I didn't know you remembered," James said, his voice hoarse, He was still trying to wrap his mind around what was happening. How was it possible that this girl, this young woman, was the same one he had saved all those years ago? Lyra nodded, her silver hair catching the light as she lowered her gaze. I never forgot you. My mother. She never forgot you either. James looked down at Zorash, still unconscious, her life hanging in the balance. The weight of the moment settled heavily on his chest. He had made that decision years ago to save a life, but he had never expected it to come back to him in this way. He had never imagined that his actions would be remembered by a child, let alone lead him to the bedside of the warrior mother of that child. He knelt down beside Zorash, his hand hovering over her. He had a job to do. He had to save her, just as he had saved her daughter all those years ago. But now, it felt like there was more at stake than just the life of one warrior. He had no idea what he was walking into, but he knew that the Tamar people had their own history, their own secrets. The questions were starting to pile up, and James wasn't sure if he was ready for the answers. "Can you help her?" Lyra asked softly, breaking him from his thoughts. James turned to look at the girl. She was waiting for an answer, her eyes full of hope, a hope that he was beginning to understand. He couldn't promise her anything, but he could try.
"I'll do everything I can," he said, his voice steady now. The words felt like a vow, one that he would keep, no matter what it cost him.
As he sat by Zorash's side, watching the steady rhythm of her breathing, James couldn't help but wonder what had brought him here, to this very moment. Was it fate? Was it simply a twist of chance that had placed him in the right place at the right time? Or had he been part of something much bigger, something that he couldn't yet understand? The questions would have to wait. Right now, all that mattered was Zorash and the life she had fought for. And maybe, just maybe, it was time to understand the consequences of the decision he had made so long ago. Lyra stood in silence, watching him. For the first time, she seemed to trust him completely. She had been a child when he saved her, but now she was a young woman, caught in the tides of fate, just like her mother. The weight of her history was just beginning to settle on her shoulders, and James knew that he was now a part of that story. Whether he liked it or not, his actions from years ago were bringing him back to a world he had long since left behind. And as the hum of the station continued around them, James realized that the past had a way of catching up with you, no matter how far you tried to run. James sat quietly beside Zorash, his eyes fixed on the warrior's still form. The soft hum of the medical machinery surrounded him, a reminder of how fragile life truly was. Zorash's condition had been critical when she arrived, and although her breathing had stabilized, there was still no sign of her waking up. The hours passed, each minute heavy with the weight of her silence. It was a waiting game now, waiting to see if she would wake, and if so, what kind of life she would return to. Lyra had left the room hours ago after asking James to promise once more that he would do everything he could to save her mother. Her small frame had disappeared into the hallway, but James could still hear the echo of her footsteps in his mind. He had never met her before today, yet he felt an undeniable connection to her, as if their paths had crossed long ago, and fate had only now brought them together. He shifted in his seat, trying to make himself comfortable in the cold, sterile room. His fingers lightly traced the edge of the table beside him, a small distraction from the heaviness in the air. He needed to focus. He had a mission. His promise to Lyra and Zorash wasn't just a promise of saving a life. It was a promise to protect the people of the Tamar, people who had been fighting for their survival in a galaxy that seemed to be shifting around them. It wasn't just about one woman anymore. It was about the survival of an entire race, an entire history that had been forgotten by many, including himself. The soft chirp of the medical console brought him back to the present. Zorash's vitals were stable, but she hadn't moved since he'd sat down. He couldn't stop thinking about the memories that Lyra had sparked in him. The child he had saved from the pirates all those years ago was now standing before him. A young woman full of strength and history. James had known little about the Tamar back then, only that he had to do what was right. But now, as the situation unfolded, he realized how little he understood of what had truly been at stake. He ran a hand through his dark hair, frustrated with himself. He had been so focused on the task at hand, so focused on his duty as a soldier, that he hadn't stopped to ask the bigger questions. Why had the Tamar been in conflict with humans for so long? Why had they been forced to the edges of the galaxy, their people scattered and broken? There was so much he didn't know, and yet here he was, entangled in their fate. His thoughts were interrupted by a soft knock on the door. He turned, surprised to see Lyra standing there again, her face serious but soft. She stepped inside, her eyes briefly flicking to her mother before settling on James. She was quiet for a moment, studying him as if trying to determine something he wasn't aware of. Her gaze was piercing, yet there was a vulnerability behind it. She had seen the worst of the universe, but she still carried hope.
"You don't have to stay," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper.
"You don't owe us anything." James blinked, unsure of what she meant. He had promised to stay, to help her mother, but her words made him question everything.
"I'm here because I made a promise," he replied, his voice steady despite the uncertainty building inside him. "I'll stay until your mother wakes up." Lyra nodded, though she didn't seem entirely convinced.
She crossed the room and sat on the edge of the chair near the bed, her small frame tense, as if waiting for something to happen. James could feel the weight of her words, of her expectations. This wasn't just about saving her mother. It was about saving a people, an entire civilization that had been on the brink of extinction. "You know why she's like this?" Lyra asked after a long pause, her voice cracking slightly.
"Why she's so sick?"
James shook his head. He had asked the medical team for any answers, but none had been forthcoming. The Tamar had many secrets, many illnesses that were unique to them, but nothing he had encountered in his years as a soldier had prepared him for something like this. He didn't know what had caused it. He didn't know if he could fix it.
"I'm not sure," he said, his voice low. "But we'll find out."
"I'll make sure of it." Lyra seemed to relax slightly at his words. She leaned forward in her chair, her eyes never leaving Zora Ash's still form. There was a sadness to her gaze, a deep longing that James couldn't quite place.
"She's not just my mother," Lyra said, her voice soft but steady. She's the last of our kind."
The last of their kind? What did that mean? Lyra seemed to read his confusion and nodded slowly. The Tamar were once a proud and powerful race, but the war with the humans, well, it nearly destroyed us.
"The others, they're scattered. Few of us remain."
James could hear the pain in her voice, the sorrow of a people who had been torn apart by forces beyond their control. He couldn't imagine what it must have been like for them.
To lose everything, to have their culture, their history, their future ripped away. And yet, here she was, standing in front of him, still fighting for her people, still carrying the weight of a legacy that had been buried by time. "Zorash," Lyra continued, her voice faltering for a moment, "was one of the leaders. She fought to protect us, to keep us alive. And now—" She trailed off, unable to finish her sentence. James could see the pain in her eyes, the fear of losing the last person who could lead them. He didn't know the history, the details of the Tamar's fall from grace, but he understood loss. He understood what it felt like to have everything taken away, to have the people you cared about ripped from your life. And in that moment, he understood that his promise to save Zorashash wasn't just about saving one warrior. It was about saving the last hope for a race that had been on the brink of extinction for far too long. He stood up from his chair and walked to the window, looking out at the stars. There was so much he didn't understand, so much he couldn't comprehend. But one thing was certain: he couldn't walk away. Not now. Not after everything that had happened. He had made a promise, and he would keep it. "I'll find a way to save her," he said, more to himself than to Lyra. "I won't let you lose her." Lyra stood up, her posture softening as she approached him. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice filled with emotion. James didn't know what to say to that. He wasn't sure if he was thanking himself or apologizing for the things he had failed to do in the past. But in that moment, he understood something deep inside him. It wasn't just about fixing what had been broken. It was about moving forward, about building something new from the ashes of the past. They stood there in silence, both of them staring out at the stars, each lost in their own thoughts. The weight of the galaxy seemed to rest on their shoulders, and yet, in that moment, it didn't feel so heavy. There was hope. There was a chance to rebuild, and for the first time in a long time, James believed it was possible. The silence was broken by a faint movement from the bed. James turned quickly, his heart leaping into his throat. Zorash's eyes fluttered open, and she looked at him with a mixture of confusion and recognition. "James," she whispered, her voice weak but steady. He stepped forward, his hand hovering near her, unsure of how to respond. But before he could say anything, Zorasha reached out, her fingers trembling as they brushed against his hand. "Thank you," she said, her voice barely audible. "You saved my daughter." James felt a wave of relief wash over him. She was awake. She was alive. And with that, the first chapter of their story had begun. Zorash lay still for a moment, her golden eyes slowly adjusting to the light that bathed the sterile medical ward. Her fingers twitched as she began to regain her strength, and with a soft groan, she shifted slightly on the bed. James stood by her side, his heart racing as he watched the woman who had once been a symbol of strength for her people, now lying fragile before him. Her gaze swept across the room, her eyes flicking over James and then resting on her daughter, Lyra, who had been standing at the far side of the room, waiting silently.
Zorash's lips parted as if she wanted to speak but was too weak to find the strength.
It wasn't until Lyra stepped forward, her hand resting lightly on her mother's arm, that Zorash finally spoke. "Lyra," she murmured, her voice hoarse. "My child." Lyra leaned down, brushing a lock of hair away from her mother's forehead. "You're safe now, Mom. You're alive." Zorash's eyes focused on Lyra for a long moment, and then, with effort, she turned her gaze toward James. There was something in her eyes, a mix of recognition and suspicion, as if she were trying to place him, as if she couldn't remember the exact details, but knew him from somewhere deep within her memories. "You!" she started weakly, her voice trailing off as her breathing steadied. "You're the one who saved her?" James nodded, his voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't know it at the time, but I did everything I could." Zorash's eyes closed, and she exhaled a long, slow breath. She had been through so much in her life, fighting to protect her people, battling enemies on distant planets, and now facing the greatest battle of all, survival. But as she lay there, with her daughter by her side and the human who had unknowingly saved her child standing before her, something within her began to stir, a new sense of determination, perhaps even hope. Lyra watched her mother closely, her eyes filled with a quiet intensity. She knew the weight of their people's history, the legacy of pain and loss that had followed them across the stars. But she also knew that the Tamar had endured. They had survived wars and betrayal. And now, her mother was awake, alive, and that meant they had a chance, perhaps the only chance, to rebuild what had been lost.
"We need to talk," Zorash said suddenly, her voice gaining strength as she sat up slightly in the bed.
James instinctively moved closer, ready to offer his help, but she waved him off, her warrior spirit still present despite her weakened state. Lyra exchanged a glance with James before moving to sit beside her mother. "What is it, Mom?" she asked, her voice calm but filled with the kind of seriousness only a daughter who had seen the worst of the universe could possess. Zora Ash's eyes flickered with something akin to fear before she spoke. "The Hollow Order. They are coming for us." The mention of the Hollow Order caused a chill to pass through the room. James had heard the name before, an underground faction of humans who had once been allies to the Tamar before the war had torn them apart. But what the Tamar had endured at the hands of this group was something James had only begun to understand. The Hollow Order wasn't just a group of traitors. They were ruthless, driven by power, and willing to do anything to eliminate those they saw as a threat. Lyra's expression darkened. "We know," she said quietly.
"They've been after us for years, but they've grown stronger, more organized."
"The attacks have been escalating. They won't stop until they've wiped us out." Zora Ash's eyes hardened. "We can't allow that to happen."
"I won't let them destroy what's left of my people."
James felt the weight of her words settle over him. He had no idea what the full scope of the Tamar's suffering had been. All he knew was that they were a proud and powerful people, and they had been brought to the edge of extinction by the very people they had once called allies. But now, standing before him, he could see the fire still burning in Zoraj's eyes. Despite everything, she still had the heart of a warrior. And somehow, he found himself wanting to help.
"What do we need to do?"
James asked, his voice steady. Zora Ash's gaze softened as she studied him, her expression guarded but not unfriendly.
"We need allies. We can't face the Hollow Order alone, not with what we have left."
"But there are those who still remember the old alliances, those who will stand with us."
James nodded. "I'll help however I can, but we need to act fast."
Zorash sighed deeply, her body still weak from the illness that had nearly claimed her life. "I can't lead them in my current state, but you, human."
"You may be our best hope." James blinked, not sure if he had heard her correctly.
"What do you mean?" Lyra looked at him with a strange mixture of respect and concern. "The prophecy speaks of a human who will rise to lead the Tamar, to unite our people and protect us from the Hollow Order. Some say it's just a myth, a story told to children. But there are those who believe it's real."
James shook his head. "I'm no leader."
"I'm just a soldier!" Zora Ash's gaze softened.
"You may be just a soldier, but you saved my daughter. You did what no one else would have done." "In my eyes, that makes you something more." Her words struck him harder than he had expected. For so long he had lived by the rules of the military, always following orders and never questioning the greater purpose. But now, as he stood before these people, these beings who had suffered so much, he felt something stir inside him, something more than duty, more than responsibility. He felt the weight of their trust, and for the first time in his life, he understood what it truly meant to protect someone. "I'll help," he said finally, his voice steady. "But I'll need your help too. We need to figure out how to stop the Hollow Order once and for all." Zorash nodded, a faint smile crossing her face despite the pain she was clearly feeling. "We'll need to contact the remnants of our allies, the people who still remember the old war, the ones who haven't forgotten our cause."
"Here."
Lyra stood up, a determination settling over her features.
"I'll start the search. There are contacts on the outer colonies who still owe us their loyalty." James couldn't help but be impressed by the strength in Lyra's voice.
She had grown into something far more than the child he had saved all those years ago. She was a leader in her own right, someone who could help unite the Tamar once more. But they needed more than just strength. They needed a strategy, a plan. They couldn't just rush headlong into a fight with the Hollow Order. They needed to know who their true allies were, who they could trust. For the next few hours, they began formulating a plan. James listened closely as Zora-Ash and Lyra discussed their next steps, offering his insights when he could. He had been part of countless military operations before, but this felt different. There was something more personal at stake now. It wasn't just about military strategy. It was about survival, about protecting a people who had been pushed to the edge of extinction. As the night wore on, Zora-Ash began to feel stronger, the healing process slowly taking hold. She insisted on getting out of bed, wanting to help with the plans, but her body refused to cooperate. James and Lyra gently guided her back to the bed, insisting she rest.
"You've done enough for today, James," said softly. "We'll take it from here."
Zora-Ash looked at him, her eyes filled with gratitude and something else, something like hope. "I trust you," she whispered, before drifting back into a peaceful slumber. James stood by her side for a while, watching over her. The room was quiet again, the hum of the station the only sound. He didn't know what the future held for him or for the Tamar, but one thing was certain: their fight was just beginning, and whatever came next, he would face it with them. For the first time in a long time, he felt like he was part of something bigger than himself, and it felt like the right place to be. The following days on the space station were filled with urgency. James, Zora-Ash, and Lyra knew they didn't have much time. The Hollow Order was growing more powerful by the day, and their influence had begun to spread across the galaxy, like a dark shadow threatening to swallow everything in its path. If they were to have any chance of survival, they needed to act quickly, gathering allies and preparing for the war that loomed on the horizon. James spent his time moving between the medical bay and the operations room. Zora-Ash, though still weak, was determined to help. Even as she recovered, she made it clear that the Tamar needed a leader, someone to rally their people. Lyra, though her focus remained on finding old allies, kept a close watch on her mother, checking in on her at regular intervals. The young warrior was becoming more than just a daughter trying to save her mother. She was becoming a leader in her own right, one who was capable of facing the daunting future ahead. James had come to respect her strength, and as the days wore on, he found himself more involved in their cause. At first, it had felt like a duty, an obligation to keep his promise and protect the life of a child he had once saved. But now, it was something much more than that. There was a bond forming between them, one that ran deeper than just simple survival. There was something powerful about standing together in the face of an unstoppable enemy, about fighting for a cause greater than oneself. The quiet hum of the station echoed through the hallways as James made his way to the operations room for the final briefing. Zora-Ash was there, sitting at the head of the table. She looked stronger now, though her skin still held the pallor of someone recovering from a serious illness. Her golden eyes shone with determination, and the air around her felt charged with the energy of someone preparing for battle. Lyra stood next to her mother, her posture straight and proud. She had changed in the last few days. The young woman who had once been so unsure of herself now radiated confidence, the mark of someone who had accepted the weight of their history and was ready to carry it forward.
"James," Zora-Ash said as he entered the room, her voice commanding despite the weariness that still clung to her.
"We have gathered all the information we could about the Hollow Order. Now, we need to make a decision."
James nodded, his expression serious. He had been waiting for this moment, the moment when they would move beyond the planning and into action. The Hollow Order wasn't just a threat to the Tamar, it was a threat to the galaxy itself. They had already shown their willingness to destroy anyone who stood in their way, regardless of race or allegiance. James couldn't afford to hesitate any longer. He couldn't afford to fail. "What are our options?" he asked, his voice steady. Zora-Ash turned to a holographic map projected in the center of the room, her hand waving over it to bring up images of the stations and planets under threat. The Hollow Order had already begun attacking the outer colonies, using their connections to manipulate key leaders and instigate chaos. The group was vast, and their resources were nearly limitless. But despite their power, They lacked something the Tamar had: unity and purpose. "We have two options," Sorashah said, pointing to the map. "We can either fight them where they are weakest, on the outskirts of their territory, or we can infiltrate their stronghold and confront them directly.
If we attack the outer colonies, we will have a chance to gather more support, but the Hollow Order will know we are coming. It's a gamble."
Lyra spoke up, her voice quiet but full of resolve. "Infiltration is risky, but it might give us the element of surprise. If we can get inside their stronghold and disable their leadership, we might be able to scatter their forces before they can respond." James could see the logic in her plan, but he also knew how dangerous it was. The Hollow Order had spies everywhere. There would be no easy way to get close to their headquarters without risking exposure. Still, it felt like the only option. They couldn't afford a prolonged conflict. They needed to strike before the Hollow Order could grow even more powerful.
"I agree with Lyra,"
James said.
"But we'll need help. We can't do this alone."
Sorash nodded, her expression thoughtful.
"I have contacts, old allies who still owe us their loyalty."
"But we will need to act quickly. If the Hollow Order catches wind of our plan, it will be too late." James was about to respond when the door to the operations room opened and a tall figure stepped inside. It was a Timar, but this one was different. He wore a cloak of dark leather, and his face was scarred with the marks of a life lived on the edge. His presence commanded attention, and his eyes were full of secrets.
"I'm ready to assist," the Tamar said, his voice rough but steady. "My name is Tarek.
I served with Sorashah in the old days, and I owe her more than I can ever repay." Zorash's eyes softened when she saw him, though she did not immediately speak. She knew that the presence of Tarek was a turning point. The Tamar had been fractured for so long, but with people like Tarek still standing, there was hope. Hope that they could rebuild, that they could rise from the ashes of their broken past.
"We're glad to have you," James said, his voice firm. "We need all the help we can get." Tarek bowed his head slightly in acknowledgement, then looked over the map with a practiced eye.
"We'll need to infiltrate their stronghold at night. The security will be tight, but I know a way in. Once we're inside, we'll need to disable their communications and take out their leadership. If we can do that, we can scatter their forces."
"Zora!"
Ash nodded, clearly impressed by Tarek's knowledge.
"Very well. We will move under the cover of darkness, but we must be swift and silent. We cannot afford to be seen."
The team would infiltrate the Hollow Order's stronghold, disable their defenses, and eliminate the leadership before they could react. It was a dangerous mission, but it was their only option. They couldn't afford failure. As the preparations continued, James found himself feeling a mix of excitement and dread. He had been in countless battles before, but this felt different. There was something personal about this fight. It wasn't just about survival. It was about saving a people, a culture that had been pushed to the brink of extinction. It was about making sure that the Tamar didn't disappear forever, lost to the winds of time. The night of the mission arrived quickly. The station was silent as James and the team made their way to the shuttle bay, their hearts heavy with the weight of what was to come. Zorashash and Lyra were by his side, and Tarek led the way. They moved quickly, the shadows swallowing them as they entered the shuttle that would carry them toward their goal. As the shuttle lifted off and the stars stretched out before them, James felt a strange sense of calm wash over him. They were doing the right thing. For the first time in a long time, he felt like he was part of something that mattered, something bigger than himself. And as the shuttle sped toward the Hollow Order's stronghold, he knew that this fight would shape the future of the Tamar, and it would shape his future too. The mission ahead was dangerous. They all knew that. But they were united, and that unity was their greatest weapon. Together they would face the Hollow Order, and together they would decide the fate of the galaxy.